Good morning. Welcome to Dallas. As we are praying this morning, and I've been watching the news reports here, have you noticed it's been raining in Texas a lot? Wow. Let us keep this community also in our prayers with the rain and the flood and water that can always be such a gift of life can so quickly turn to destruction. So we remember the people of this community as well. I do want to welcome you. We have about 65 people here today. About half of you are MASs. If you could raise your hand if you serve as an MAS. Thank you. Thank you for the work in your ministry in helping us to assess our candidates. Thank you. Yes. And how many of you here serve with Boards of Ordained Ministry, either as staff or as a board member? Great. And thank you. Thank you for coming and being here and making the commitment to work with the MAS from your annual conference. This event, thank you, yes. This event could not have happened without our advisory committee on candidate and clergy assessment. And I would like to ask if all of them could rise, acknowledge themselves, raise their hands. Many of them are sitting here at the back of the room, but Floyd, Chris, Mike Comer, Guy Seymour is back here. I know I'm missing someone. Kathy Zell, Sarah McKinley, and Chris Adams. Did I get you all? Okay. They are the people who are responsible for good or for ill, what is about to happen in the next 2 days. So you can thank them or ask them your questions as appropriate. So we are going to be covering a breadth of subjects over the next day and a half. And as we were talking yesterday as a committee, we wanted to help you have a way to have a framework and some ways to reflect on what we're going to be talking about. So on your table, there are some reflection questions on a table tent, and I believe we have a slide for them today. I just want to raise those to your attention, and if you could keep those before you as you're talking with each other, as you're talking among your annual conferences, and as you're hearing all different kinds of information, so that when we get to tomorrow morning, we'll have some time to assimilate a lot of the knowledge that we're going to be taking in. And so we want you to think about how do the instruments that we are talking about in our assessment process that your conference uses help the church identify and credential leaders that we need. We also want you to think about how that assessment process might hinder us developing the kinds of leaders that we need. And then any best practices that you have discerned through this conference. We're going to have a time to talk about that as we close out tomorrow morning. Sarah Ibarskar, where are you? Is she here? She's in the back of the room. Sarah Ibarskar is our psychological assessment coordinator extraordinaire. She came on about a year and a half ago, right? Last April of 2017. I wanted to introduce her to you and put a name with the face. If you have questions about the process, about using Cares, any hiccups, she is a great person to be able to go to. Many of you have talked with her on the phone, I'm sure. And she will be leading a session tomorrow morning on kind of the nuts and bolts of using Cares in the MAS module. So Sarah, I'm glad you're here, and I hope that you all will take the chance to greet her and say hi to her. Finally, I want to, one more thing on that, go back to that slide, please. All of the resources that we are referring to today, the PowerPoints and a lot of our handouts, are on the BOM library. And that's not on the slide. The address for that is www.bomlibrary, all one word, .org. If you navigate to that page, on the right margin, on the right-hand side, there is a MAS event link, and you can click there, and most of our handouts and slides will be posted there that you can refer to throughout the days. And after this event is over, we will be posting the videos of the plenary session. I believe those are all the announcements I have. So I want to introduce to you our keynote speaker for this morning. Dr. Sarah Bollinger is the Director of Leadership Development and Collegiate Ministry at General Board of Higher Education and Ministry. In this role, she develops resources and programs to aid in the leadership development and formation of college and university chaplains, campus ministers, and other professionals in higher education who have responsibility for student success. Dr. Bollinger is a licensed clinical social worker in Tennessee and in Missouri and specializes in using mindfulness practices in mental health treatment. In addition to her work with GBHEM, she runs a private counseling practice where she works with clients on issues of depression, anxiety, and creative identity. Sarah joined our staff about 6 months ago or so and has been a gift and a joy to work with, and I welcome you here this morning.
Awesome. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Meg. Is this my clicker? Well, it's so great to be here with you this morning. Good morning. Thanks for having me, and thanks for being here in Dallas with us. I'll start by just telling you a little bit about myself. I'm a bit of an odd bird at GBHEM in terms of their employees there. As Meg mentioned, I'm a clinical social worker. My master's and PhD are both in social work, and I'm a mental health professional. Basically, I'm a therapist, and in addition to my work at GBHEM, I love working with my clients in my small counseling practice. This work lights me up. I'm passionate about mental health, and I'm passionate about people living their best lives. I was hired at GBHEM in response to a need from chaplains and campus ministers for resources and support around mental health with their students on campus. Apparently, before I came, GBHEM conducted a survey asking what some of the biggest challenges and needs of campus ministers are on campus, and the majority of these folks said that overwhelmingly, their students are facing increased anxiety, depression, relationship issues, and they don't know what to do. So I was asked to come on staff and respond to this need. I'll also say personally that I have struggled with depression, which was particularly bad in college. And I'm not alone in this. Actually, they say that mental health runs in my family. But in my family, we're all pretty lazy, so it's maybe more accurate to say it sort of meandered through the generations, right? But overall, my dad struggled with clinical depression. My grandmother has struggled with depression. It's something that's very dear to my heart and something that I've worked through in my own life. I am passionate about helping people find ways to treat mental illness, depression, anxiety, these things that keep us from being our best selves. So I'm excited to share that with you a little bit today. I'm going to be talking about what I found in my research since beginning this job and briefly tell you about some of the mental health trends that we're seeing on college campuses. This is critical for you as you all work with candidates and clergy members who are coming from our undergraduate and our seminaries, our college campuses around the country. You all need to know what's happening, what the pulse is on our college campuses. So my hope is that this is helpful for you as you anticipate working with this next generation of leaders in our church. We all know that mental health is so important in ministry. These are the next leaders of our congregations, right? And they need to be modeling wholeness and health to the people that they're serving. Likewise, as we help them through this process, as we help this incoming generation of leaders in our church through this process, we need to be educated about what's happening in mental health care. So I hope this is helpful for you. Let me just start by running through some of the stats, and let's see if this can work. Yeah. So 1 in 5 young adults experiences a mental illness in a given year. That's roughly 20% of people, right? You can see here that the age range of 18 to 25 has a particularly high prevalence rate of mental illness. You also see that females over males suffer from mental illness more, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But these are really high numbers, right? 20%. Kind of look around the room, 1 out of 5 of us, right? Additionally, 50% of mental illnesses begin by the age of 14, okay, and 75% begin by the age of 24. So this window, 14 to 24, is critical in terms of age of onset of mental illness. This is really important to know because this window, this age range, all types of life transitions are happening, right? You're moving out of your parents' home, you're going to college, you're developing new relationships, maybe you start dating for the first time in your life. In addition to all of those natural life transitions that are happening, about 1/5 of those folks will also get a mental health diagnosis for the first time. And so they're navigating how to take care of themselves, how to get treatment, how to access care, how to be in the world in the midst of a mental health issue. So age of onset is really important to notice, especially as we talk about young adults on college campuses. This is just a snapshot of some of the most common mental disorders. This data is pulled from an article published in 2015 from Academic Psychiatry, and it's just a summary of prevalence rates among college students. Of course, this isn't a comprehensive list. We have a whole thick diagnostic and statistical manual that outlines all of the different mental illnesses that are out in the world, but these are some of the most common that you see in this age range. So anxiety disorders, about 12% of the college population has an anxiety disorder. Depression is about 9%. Eating disorders, 9 to 10%. Attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, about 8%. The important thing to also know about this is often these are co-occurring. So you might have someone who has both anxiety and depression. You might have somebody who has anxiety and ADHD, right? So it's not so clear-cut, but hopefully this gives you just a brief understanding of some of the most common things that we're seeing. To break this down a little bit, depression, that 9% that we were talking about, falls under mood disorders. Mood disorders also include a number of other diagnoses: depression, bipolar disorder, dysthymia, seasonal affective, and others. And it's characterized by either or both a low mood, of course, or also an elevated mood. So we see with bipolar disorder, for example, you'll have periods of very low moods, but that's accented by periods of very high or hypermania. So this mood disorder, right, characterized by these high and or low moods. What's important to know about this is that these moods actually impair one's ability to function, okay? So we all have changes in our moods. We all have good days and bad days. We all have ups and downs. A disorder is characterized by an impairment in one's ability to function either in their social life, in school, in work, right? The other category of disorders, this 12% that we were seeing in the previous slide, falls under anxiety disorders. This includes general anxiety, social anxiety, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and others. And once again, this is characterized by excessive fear or anxiety beyond just normal feelings of nervousness or anxiousness. So these are just a couple of the most common disorders that we're seeing on college campuses, but obviously not exhaustive. There are many other things happening. Something to take note of, especially among this population, is substance use disorders. So over half of people with mental illnesses also have a substance use disorder. The co-occurrence of substance use disorders and other mental illness is extremely high. Although substance use disorders commonly occur with mental illnesses, it doesn't necessarily mean that one caused the other. It's hard to sort of sort that out. But there are a number of reasons that the research says that these are co-occurring. The first is that risk factors that contribute to mental illness can also contribute to substance use disorder. There are certain genetic factors that come into play. The second is that mental illness can contribute to drug use and substance use disorder. Often, if someone is feeling extremely anxious, they will want to self-medicate by taking something that helps them to relax. If they're feeling depressed, they may want to take something that helps them get a high. So there is an effort to kind of deal with the mental illness through substances. And then thirdly, substance use and addiction can contribute to the development of mental illness. It actually impacts our brain. So just something to be aware of as we're thinking about how mental illness shows up among this population. Substance use disorders, especially among students, are something that we really need to be aware of, as often the culture of college campuses, peer pressure, parties, all of those things come into play and help to introduce people to substances maybe for the first time. One other really important thing to think about is mental health among marginalized and oppressed groups. So we mentioned in the beginning that women over men experience more mental illness, 21.7% of women, 14.5% of men. Often, groups on the margin, those who are oppressed, those who face social difficulties, will have higher rates of trauma, will face sexual, verbal, emotional abuse, leading to all kinds of different mental illnesses. So women over men, this is also true for the LGBT community. They are twice as likely as straight individuals to have a mental illness. They're also more likely to die by suicide, more likely to be homeless, more likely to face abuse, more likely to be kicked out of their homes or religious institutions, and therefore more likely to suffer from a mental illness. Ethnic and racial minorities can also have high prevalence rates. American Indians and Alaskan Natives have a 28.3% prevalence rate of mental illness. So as you are thinking through work with these populations, recognizing that those populations that are on the margins, that are particularly subject to various forms of oppression in our community, actually have more mental health issues. Also, there are barriers to care for this group. For these groups. So not only are they diagnosed a little bit more than some other mainline groups, also there's less access to treatment. Often there's poor quality of care, higher levels of stigma, there's racism, bias. All of these things contribute to less access to care overall, right? So I tried here to kind of just paint a picture, a rough landscape of what we are seeing commonly on college campuses. And what I'd like you to do is process this a little bit. I know I kind of threw a lot of information at you, but I'm gonna put up a couple of questions for you. And I'd like you to turn to the others at your table and talk through some of these questions together. What are the most common mental disorders that you are seeing among candidates and clergy members? Does what we've seen in these statistics this morning hold true to your experience or not? Are there other things that you're seeing? And how equipped do you feel in helping candidates and clergy members with addressing mental health issues? So I would love for you to turn to your tables and talk a little bit about this. Also keep in mind, be conscious of confidentiality issues. So share from your experience, talk about what you've seen, but avoid mentioning any specific names, okay? I'll give you about 5-10 minutes. Okay, so I'd love to hear from some of you. What are you seeing out there? What are you seeing amongst your candidates, amongst your clergy members? Has what we've talked about this morning sort of rung true in your experience or not? Anybody want to give us some feedback from their group discussion? I can run the mic around. I would just love to hear what you're seeing amongst your clergy and candidates right now, kind of the answer to that first question. What are some of the most common mental health disorders that you're seeing? Yeah.
Well, I think the consensus at the table here is trauma-related disorders, old traumas or recent traumas.
Yeah, so that's a huge point. So actually that falls under anxiety disorders, right? The PTSD, trauma related, yes, exactly. So that's part of that 12% that we were talking about. Trauma, it's tremendous. And in fact, there's a new study out, the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study. I don't know if you all have heard about it, but actually among young people, children specifically, we're seeing incredibly high rates of trauma amongst these populations, more than we had really ever anticipated. It's a huge issue, yeah. Yeah, what else?
we see a lot of family of origin issues like domestic violence or child abuse, really painful things that are sometimes still as yet unresolved, traumatic kind of.
Yeah, so kind of similarly to what we were hearing over here, trauma, essentially. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say.
Same thing, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're seeing a lot of self-reported anxiety and depression in our candidates, some treated and some untreated.
Yeah, so how does that show up in the interview and assessment process?
They self-report in the clinical interview.
So anxiety, depression, absolutely. Yes, sir.
The one that you mentioned, which is substance abuse, and then there was another one, agoraphobia. Yeah, was another one. But there was also one that we were kind of surprised that it was not, you didn't mention it. It's an addiction, which is pornography. It's very high, but it's not mentioned. We didn't know why it was missing on your list.
Yeah, it's another common concern. I didn't mention it just because the prevalence rates of pornography, sex and pornography addiction are lower than some of the others, but absolutely it's one of the issues that people struggle with. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Anything else that we're missing? Yeah.
We talked some about the reality of the anxiety about the process itself, presenting itself in the interview and all that, and ferreting out what is anxiety due to the process and what is anxiety due to life experience.
Yeah, so that's a good point, right? Anxiety disorders are about anxiety that causes impairment. That's different than just normal anxiety about a process that you might be nervous about, but where does the disorder come in? And sometimes it's hard to know. Is this kind of just normal anxiousness about a process, or is this a disorder? Yeah.
Just to piggyback on that, I found that the first, maybe 5 or 10 minutes of the interview process is simply settling the anxiety down of the candidates. They're incredibly anxious, and of course they should be. But once that goes away, then it's a matter of sorting out whether there's really an anxiety disorder versus just a situational anxiety.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. That's kind of exactly what we were hearing here. Yeah.
Something that I do think that we did not specifically talk about, but I think I'd love to make sure that we take into consideration is the idea of post-traumatic growth and the strengths that persons have, and not over-pathologize this process of evaluation.
Yes, thank you for saying that. We're going to talk about that actually in a little bit, kind of a strengths-based method and how the potential for growth is possible in all of our candidates, right? Yeah, so I'm going to switch to this mic now. Multiple mics here. So thank you all so much for your feedback, and we're going to have an opportunity to process this a little bit more. But it sounds like you are seeing a lot of these things that we were talking about in your experience with candidates and clergy members. What's critically important to recognize is that most of the research confirms that we are in the midst of an epidemic of mental health disorders, especially among college students. So rates of depression, anxiety, and other disorders are higher in this generation of young people than they have ever been in generations of young people. Admittedly, this is difficult to measure. It's hard to look at changing rates of mental illness across generations, but there are a number of different studies that seek to understand this, and they're seeing very important and very, very alarming trends. So The largest community-based cross-sectional study of mental illness reports greater lifetime risks of mood disorders and specifically major depressive disorder. This study was done by Ron Kessler, who is a renowned prevalence researcher. He looks specifically at the rates of mental illness across generations, and he's at Harvard. This design that he used for this large study that documented this uses retrospective methodology. In other words, he looks back and asks people to give their account. The criticism of this study is that it's subject to recall bias, right? People aren't exactly remembering all of their experiences. So there's that. But there's another recent study that is confirming these findings. So this figure here is the results of a recent study, which is a cross-temporal meta-analysis. That's a lot of words. But basically, it's a longitudinal study of MMPI results, which is the assessment that we use here. And it documents the results of the MMPI scales from 1933 all the way through 2007. This study measured birth cohort data across multiple time points, which gave us time lag data. So in other words, it's not subject to recall bias like the previous study that I was talking about. This is important because it wasn't retrospective. It's real-time MMPI results across the generations, right? So this scale is the depression scale that's on the MMPI, and in the study, they found that young adults were 6 to 8 times more likely to meet the cutoff for pathological score on the clinical depression scale in 2007 compared to their peers in 1938. 6 to 8 times more likely to be depressed. That's staggering, right? In the same study, the researchers found significant increases in psychopathic deviation, paranoia, schizophrenia, hypomania. This is the psychopathic deviation scale on the MMPI, which measures social maladjustments. The items on the scale tap into complaints about family, authority figures. It also talks about self-alienation, social alienation. Students score more than a standard deviation higher on this scale in 2007 as compared to the 1930s. We're seeing the same results in anxiety and other disorders across the board. We're seeing increases in mental health issues in these generations. So what's going on here? What's happening? Why, right, is the next question. The woman who did this research, Jean Twenge is her name, she recently published a book about this called iGen, and she also had an article in The Atlantic that talks about all of the findings from her research. And I'm gonna quickly run through some of her findings, but much of what she says are the reasons that we're seeing higher rates of mental illness is the invention and introduction of smartphones, screens, and the increasing use of technology and how it has played a critical role in our mental health. And I find this really fascinating. So here are just some of her data. So this graph shows times per week that teenagers go out with their parents, or go out without their parents. So when they're going out with their friends, their parents are at home. You can see a dramatic decrease in the number of times that teens are hanging out with their parents. And if you look at that line, we see 2007 was when the iPhone is released. And we see a dramatic decline. The same is true for dating patterns. So this is percentage of teens who ever go out on dates. Once again, 2007, the iPhone comes out, crash, right? Here, students were asked if they often feel left out of things or if they feel lonely a lot of the time. And this is the percentage of students who agree or mostly agree with that statement. Once again, you see increase in loneliness, being left out. And this is the percentage of students who get less than 7 hours of sleep most nights, and that percentage has dramatically increased as well. So these are dramatic changes, and it's critical to take this information into account as we think about the impact of this in our ministry settings. What does it mean that this next generation of folks are both on their screens a lot, very technologically savvy, but they're also lonely and isolated? They're not dating. They are not sleeping, right? What's happening? How do we navigate this as we think about this incoming generation of folks? So I'd like you to turn back to your groups and talk about some of these questions. Have you noticed any of these shifts among the college students with whom you work? How have you seen smartphones impact this generation of young adults, or not, maybe? And what other factors might contribute to the increase of mental health issues among young adults? Okay? Again, I'll give you 5 to 10 minutes.
All right. So I would love just to hear back from the groups a little bit. What are you seeing out there? Have you seen smartphones impact this generation of young adults? What does that look like for you? And what have you noticed? What have you been talking about? Anyone want to volunteer? Yes.
We were talking about the impact of particularly smartphones on making people accessible 100% of the time. And most recently in our conversation was trying to help candidates and young folks understand that they don't have to be, just because they can be accessible constantly, they don't have to be accessible constantly.
Yes, exactly. So teaching boundaries, right? Yeah, good. Yeah.
Talking? We were too busy tweeting and Snapchatting. I don't want to speak for the table, but it's very interesting to notice that there's I call it a digital divide between younger people, and I'm an older person, okay, and those of us that are a little older, that there's a disconnect in communication, and that people don't take the opportunity to reflect face to face or learn to speak to people rather than to a screen. And I think there's a loss in that. And if there's anything we can convey to our younger folks is to continue to talk face to face. You know, see your friends, go to Starbucks and talk to each other, don't just text. So.
Yes. Right. So like empathy, presence, eye contact, some of these key skills that help us to develop depth in relationship are critical, right? And maybe the hypothesis is that maybe we're losing that. Yeah.
I'm an MAS. I'm also the chair of my home church's Staff Parish Relations Committee. And we, with a former pastor, we had a prominent person in our church die. And the pastor did not make a call on that family. And the family spoke to me, so I spoke to the pastor, who said, quote, I sent him an email.
Yes, and for maybe the younger generations, maybe that's all they know. Maybe that's how they've learned to deal with grief and loss. They don't have the coping skills. They don't have the mechanisms to sit with that, right? Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, over here. I'm getting my exercise this morning. Yes, ma'am.
I think our table understands and appreciates the impact that smartphones, technology has had on young people. But the other question that we raised here is whether the MMPI, having its last revision some time ago, really actually reflects what is going on in the world today. And so if it were an MMPI that was the MMPI 3 as opposed to the MMPI 2 that kind of took into account what's kind of going on in the world, maybe those numbers, maybe those elevations would be different. And I just think that's something that we need to keep in mind.
Yeah, so questions about measurement tools and how we understand, tracking those things.
We were talking a little bit about how social media can affect ministerial ethics, like when a pastor changes appointments, how do you unfriend the members of your congregation, or how do you, how do you handle that, because it's become an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, send them an email, right? Yeah. Yikes. Yeah. Good. Any other comments? So it sounds like we're all seeing the impacts of this, right? This is a common thing that we're dealing with in ministry. Yeah, we have one more here.
I know it's always tricky with looking at a graph, looking at research, and one has to be able to look at the reliability, validity of the measurements. With that backdrop, you see some variation in those graphs. So one of the folks at the table said, how much is also related to financial challenges, the economic cycles. One thing I noticed was the graph. If you look at the sleep graph, I mean that's a significant variable. That has a significant impact on who we are as a whole person. So there are a number of different factors going on. And at our table, we also talked about the MMPI. If all the different indices of the MMPI we see an increase in, then the argument could be made that is not necessarily an increase in all of those diagnoses, but the norms have changed, and or people are more willing to acknowledge these issues in their life. So those are some interfering variables that would have to be fleshed out.
Yeah, and that article, the Twangy article that I was pulling data from, has a limitations section and stuff. If anybody wants to read that, I can absolutely forward it to you. But yes, right, so co-occurring variables, how do we deal with that? How do we think about our measurement tools? All of those things come into play. Certainly, we have to look at that. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of what you were referring to here, some of the other reasons, some of the other things that we know may or may not be impacting mental health prevalence rates or mental disorder prevalence rates. So, we've mentioned that increasing use of technology has found to be correlated with increasing mental disorders, right? So Twangy's research, this study that we've been talking about, found that teens who spend 5 or more hours per day on their devices are 71% more likely to have a risk factor for suicide. That's regardless of content consumed. That's time watching screens and not just what it is they're watching. They could be watching cat videos, they could be watching something more serious for the news. It's correlated with time on screens. Yeah, so 5 or more hours per day is correlated with a 71%, they're 71% more likely to have a risk factor for suicide. Yeah. So this is also correlated with depression and anxiety, screen time, right? So we are seeing that certainly there is a correlation in the research. Now, are there extraneous variables that may play into this? Absolutely, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. The other thing that we're seeing is that screens, specifically smartphones, are as addictive as hard drugs, right? So we, the push notifications, and every time, your phone dings and you get an email or you get a text or that little red number on the Facebook app pops up, that's addictive. And in fact, it produces the same chemical responses in your brain as a hit of an illicit drug. It's like a high. And so not only is increased screen time bad for us. But those who have designed the iPhones have specifically designed them so that we keep coming back, right? So that we're on them more and we get more apps and we're on Facebook and we're on social media. And so we are compelled to continue to get on them. And I will say that this isn't necessarily the fault of our young adults, right? Previous generations, we've created this amazing technology, and I don't want to poo-poo all of technology. Obviously, it's wonderful what we're able to do. We can communicate across the world. We can send a text message in an instant. We know that this has improved our lives in a lot of ways. However, we created all of this stuff, and then we just handed it to babies, literally out of the womb, right? Baby Einstein and all of these other things. Kids were attached to screens from day one. It's like handing a baby morphine. Here, play with this, right? We didn't give them the tools. We didn't give them the ways to manage it or handle it. And so I don't put the blame on this younger generation, right? We use the tools don't use us. So we have to be mindful of how to make sure that we are maintaining control rather than them controlling us. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this slide. So increasing use of technology, right? We know that that's one factor that impacts these increasing rates of mental illness. Inability to self-regulate is something else that comes up in the literature. So this is partially tied into the use of screens and technology, but it also has to do with some of the practical skills that young adults are given or not given as they're being raised. We're seeing parents with fewer children. We're seeing parents who are a lot more attentive, perhaps. Another generation, you may have heard the term helicopter parenting, right? Trends in parenting have changed such that the child is the sole focus of the parent's attention, and parents intervene on behalf of children when they feel anxious or upset, right? They never have to actually cope. And so there is some research that says this generation of young adults have been coddled perhaps more than others. There's a new book that came out recently that talks about this culture of safetyism, where we are protecting this generation of young adults from anything that threatens their well-being, and therefore when they get out in the real world they don't know how to manage. And again, that's not the fault of this generation as much as it is previous generations, right? And how we've parented and how we've taught them. The next reason is increased loneliness and isolation. So yes, technology has impacted this, but in addition, we're living in a more individualistic society. We drive our own cars to work. We don't run into each other in the neighborhood much. Generations of people live separately. Grandma goes to a retirement home rather than moving in with the family, right? We have become a culture of individualism. We are separated. We are isolated more than we've ever been before. And the research is finding that this is impacting our mental health, believe it or not, right? This shifting cultural emphasis is a really interesting one. So there's some research that talks about how our culture has shifted from a culture of being intrinsically motivated and motivated by intrinsic values versus extrinsic values or extrinsic goals. So American culture, the research says, has shifted toward individual achievement, money, status, right? Getting the right car, getting the right salary, all of these career goals. And that's not inherently a bad thing. But the emphasis then shifts away from social relationships, community, communication. We're more focused as a society on materialism and status and less focused on meaning in life and affiliation. This increase in materialistic values really started to be noticed in the research around the 1970s and has continued to rise over time. And likewise, intrinsic goals have waned. Fewer college students see it as important to develop a meaningful philosophy of life, right? They're less involved in community groups. They have fewer friends. More people live alone. And then some of the reasons also have to do with just
biology, right? So our modern diet has changed drastically. We're seeing increasing rates of obesity. This impacts our mental health. In the same way, we're more sedentary. We sit in offices in, neon lights and conference centers. We're less exposed to kind of the natural rhythms of our world. We're not outside in natural light nearly as much. They think that this has an impact on sleep patterns, as you were saying here, but also just kind of mood regulations, right, as we're inside more and more and more. So these are a rough smattering of all of the other things that may contribute to some of the rises in mental illness that we've been seeing among this population. Of course, there's no one, silver bullet that addresses all of these issues or all of the reasons. We can't know for sure, but this is our best guess based on the research. So with all of this information, all that we know about the reasons that mental illness is on the rise and what's happening in this generation, it's also important to talk about the myths about mental illness. One myth is that mental illnesses are a sign of weakness or personality flaw, right? Who's heard this? They're lazy. There's something wrong with them, right? The reality is that depression and other mental health problems have nothing to do with laziness or lack of willpower. And as we've just heard, a lot of this mental illness in this generation has to do with their inheritance, what we've passed down from generations before. Here's technology, unmanaged, unmonitored, go, right? Here's a 9-to-5 job that's actually 8 to 6, and you sit inside all day long. Hope that you're well, right? We've passed on these traditions, and now we're reaping what we sow. How do we think about that in terms of raising up this next generation of folks? Another myth is that people with mental health problems are violent and unpredictable. The reality is that many people with mental disorders are highly active and productive members of society, that indeed they can be wonderfully reliable, effective, and highly successful. And the other myth is that there's no hope for people with mental problems, that we should just write them off and relegate them to the sidelines. And that's absolutely not true. Studies show that people with mental health problems actually get better. And many people completely recover with proper treatment and, in fact, lead very productive, happy, and fulfilled lives. So we've talked about some of the statistics, what we're seeing in terms of mental health prevalence rates, mental illness prevalence rates. We've also talked about some of the reasons why we think this might be happening. And we've talked about some of the myths, right? So what do we do now? We have all of this information at our fingertips. We have all of the statistics and many of the reasons why. And I would like to postulate that the good news is that there is hope, and that we, as Christians, have a corner market on hope, actually. Our faith has something to say about this. We are called not just to live, but to live abundantly, right? And there are specific strategies and ideals that help us in living this abundant life, in bringing health and wholeness for those who are suffering with mental illnesses. We are light, right? We are salt. And actually, we can make a difference in these folks' lives. And I'm not talking about, a rigid set of religious rules or church attendance or a checkbox of things that we want them to do. You know that young adults are not finding traditional religious affiliation compelling in the same way that previous generations have, right? So this isn't about institutions as much as it is a promise for hope and light that our faith brings in spontaneous and creative and unfettered ways. It's about purpose and love and joy. It's about demonstrating living into this calling. So How do we do that, right? If our faith has something to say about how we address this mental health crisis in our country, what does that actually look like? There is a mental health first aid training that is available, and I have found it remarkably helpful. And what I found is that it provides strategies to help people who are struggling with mental illness. And the strategies are really amazing and foster a lot of hope. And this is not specifically a Christian curriculum. In fact, it's very explicitly secular. But many of the principles that are used embody what it is that we're all about, what our faith is all about. And I found it tremendously helpful as we think about how to address some of these problems. So this recovery paradigm is a set of ideals and ways to go about helping people recover. And most interestingly, the very first ideal in the recovery paradigm is hope, right? We go into working with people who have mental illness with a posture of hope, knowing that we are light, that we are salt, helping to instill this hope, helping to model this hope, helping to be this hope, and ultimately helping them to grasp a hold of their own hope, right? So modeling hope. The recovery paradigm is also strengths-based. As a social worker, I love this. We always talk about strengths. Often in mental health treatment, the framework is looking at an illness, right? We go in and say this person is sick. This is everything that's wrong with them. This is kind of getting to what you were talking about. The recovery paradigm says, actually, that's not the way to go about doing this. What we do is we start from a perspective of strength. What gifts, talents, skills, knowledge, experience does this person have? How are they created uniquely in God's image? How is it that they shine? And then what we do is we capitalize on those strengths, right? We say, okay, you're great at these things. Let's start from there. How do we use those strengths to motivate you in your recovery process? How do I highlight those things? How do I pull those things out of you, strengthen those within you, and help you to use them as tools toward recovery, right? So strengths-based. The recovery paradigm also uses peer support often. So support groups, regular get-togethers. I don't know exactly how you all do it in your conferences, but with candidates and those who are kind of going through this process of assessment, maybe even getting them together, helping them to work together through this process, creating peer support so they know they're not alone. The recovery paradigm emphasizes responsibility. In other words, it's not going to be done for them, but they, the individuals who are struggling, are responsible. And so we look toward behavior change, and we want to see these things, and we want to motivate you, and we want to put that decision on you for you to decide to be well. We also recognize that recovery is non-linear. So there will be, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Sometimes you'll see progress, and that will be followed with some failure. And that's okay, right? That is part of the paradigm. That is incorporated into how we work. And that's true for all of us, whether we have a mental health diagnosis or not, right? It's a non-linear process. This paradigm is holistic, so we look not just at the mind, but the physical body, the heart, the soul. It's individualized to each unique person and their specific diagnosis. And we focus on empowerment and respect, right? So this is how we begin to think about, to wrap our minds around working with folks who have a diagnosis. So what do we do in the moment? Someone is sitting in front of you in an assessment interview and they completely decompensate. What do you do? This is how to use some of these ideals, to use this recovery paradigm in practical ways. So the first thing is if someone is decompensating, We assess for suicidality or harm. Are they going to hurt themselves or someone else? And maybe that is implied, but it's critically important that someone doesn't leave your office and go hurt themselves or hurt somebody else, right? So that's the foundation. As long as they're stable enough that we know that they're not going to do that, we listen non-judgmentally. Tell me what's going on. What are you feeling, right? We listen. We just allow them time to talk and process. And non-judgmentally is key. We're not saying, oh gosh, they're certainly going to fail this, right? They're not going anywhere in their lives. But genuinely open, genuinely receptive to their experience and what they're hearing. We give reassurance and information if we have some basic statistics, if we have some resources. It's really critical. Of course, then we encourage appropriate help. And I would advocate for having a list of therapists, psychologists, support groups that might be in your area, that might be available to these folks. And then lastly, we encourage self-help and support strategies, and this is key, right? So we've talked about this modern culture that this generation has inherited, that has been kind of handed down to them. Here's all of this technology, here's all of this modern way of being. But we haven't given them skills or tools to moderate that, to operate within that. And so teaching self-help strategies is fundamental in helping people to stay well. How do you monitor your phone? How do you monitor your thoughts? How do you engage in relationship? What is that like for you? So I just want to give you a couple of these self-help strategies that might be helpful for you, but also for the people that you're working with. The first are just some tips around healthy screen use, right? So we talked about how 5 hours a day really leads to an increase in suicide risk. We see that the cutoff is about 2 hours a day before we start seeing some correlation between increased anxiety and depression. So the first tip is to set a schedule, right? Know when you're going to be on your phone and when you're not. And when you're not, don't check it. And again, it's addictive, right? So you'll want to, you'll be compelled to. Be mindful of that. Again, we try to use the phone less than 2 hours a day. When we are out with friends, when we're at dinner with our family members, when we're in meetings, put your phone away. It might help to have a basket, on the kitchen counter or something where everyone puts their phones, or, in the dorm room, right, where they put them when they come in from the day. Whatever it is, have a set time that when you're with one another, you're really with one another. You're present. You're fully there. Turning off push notifications can be really helpful. So again, we were talking about those dings and the red dots. Just turning them off, right? So that when you're checking your phone, you're intentionally, purposefully checking your phone. And when you're not compelled to look at it. And then don't take your phone to bed. Often the last thing we see before we go to bed and the first thing we see when we wake up is our phone. I mean, how many people do that, right? An old school alarm clock is $10. Make the investment. Do it, right? It really, really helps. So screen use, right, is one way that we can help to foster self-help techniques. The other thing is mindfulness, meditation, and spiritual practices. So the research is overwhelmingly supportive of mindfulness techniques to help eliminate symptoms of depression, anxiety, stress, among all kinds of other issues. When we are able to cultivate our awareness, to sit, to be mindful of our thoughts, it actually improves our mental health. And once again, as Christians, we have something very specific to say about this. We have a culture, we have a tradition that is rich in spiritual practices, right? Meditation, centering prayer, Lectio Divina, all of these things. We have a corner market on this. And so we, as those who are leaders in our ministry, can help to facilitate this amongst our upcoming generation of leaders in our church. So I'd like for us to just break out one more time before we end and talk about how you stay well personally. Do you employ any of these techniques, screen use, meditation, mindfulness, spiritual practices, or others, right? Those are just a couple. And then how do you talk about mental health and well-being with your candidates, clergy members, colleagues, as they're going through this process? Are there ways that you can support them in their own wellness, in their self-help techniques, and helping to cultivate self-care? Okay. So once again, just take 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, let's hear back from your group discussions. How do you stay well? And how do you talk about mental health and well-being with your clergy members, candidates? Anyone have enlightening thoughts? Thanks.
We talked about at our table of individually having someone that we see regularly, a therapist, a coach, that can help us in distinguishing the role versus us as a person, so modeling some of what we've talked about. Locally within the church I serve, I mentioned we have shifted a lot of our benevolence funds away from food, rent, and utilities to mental health, and so making that available, being able to help folks because access to mental health care still continues to be a challenge.
Awesome. So I'm just going to reiterate, get your own counseling. Go to therapy. If you're not going, go. And encourage your clergy members, your candidates to go, right? It works. That's the thing that we know in the research. It works. And therapy, counseling, is a little bit different than coaching. Coaching is great and wonderful, but often it's focused on career development or personal goal attainment, things like that. That's different than mental health treatment, okay? So get counseling. Encourage those who are under your care to get counseling. It is so beneficial. It's changed my life. Obviously, I've seen the impact in the lives of my clients. And I can't overstate that enough. And having structures in place within your conference that help to support that as well, right? Did I see a hand? Yeah.
We talked about the importance of whole person care, mind, body, spirit, community. Often find that individuals are not being active enough. They're not exercising, whether it's in a group or something that takes care of their physical body, for example. That's all part of this whole mental health, all part of whole person health.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't separate, the mental and emotional well-being from our physical well-being, and we were seeing that in the research, right? How we eat, how we exercise, how active we are. Those have huge impacts on our well-being. Yeah.
One of the things that was pretty clear at our table here is that each annual conference do things differently. You have different sort of roles that you expect from the MAS and what you expect from the Board of Ordained Ministry. We're fortunate enough to have 2 of our members here that are from the Board of Ordained Ministry and so on. In West Ohio, where I'm from, as well as Vicki, the roles are very clearly distinguished between what we as MAS are charged to do and what the Board of Ordained Ministry is charged to do. Our role as MAS is not to, provide any care or, oversight and so on, but simply to do the assessment of what the psychological data shows and then to pass that on to the Board of Ordained Ministry. And if there are some remarkable things that need to be attended to, then it's up to the Board of Ordained Ministry to care for the candidates around those kinds of concerns.
Yeah, so that's an important distinction, right? So someone who is in charge of assessment, administering the MMPI, obviously their role is very different from those who receive those results or the candidate themselves. And so working together as a unit to kind of figure out, okay, what happens when the assessment reveals X, Y, Z? Then what do we do, right? Yeah, good. Any other last minute thoughts, conclusions, insights? Yeah, well, I was hearing some really wonderful things just in terms of self-care for those of us sitting here, how we're managing and paying attention to our own well-being, but then also how we set up systems to make sure that we're caring for those who are going through this process, right? The candidates, the clergy members themselves. How do we think about that as a conference? Before I end, I just want to do a little plug here. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I was hired by GBHEM to come on and address some of these concerns among college ministers, chaplains, those who are dealing firsthand with students. And so my work over the last 8 months that I've been here is to come up with a curriculum that facilitates and helps to address well-being among students. This isn't a clinical tool, obviously, because it's for campus ministers and chaplains to use, but it is a curriculum around well-being that uses some of the things that we've talked about, relationship building techniques, meditation and mindfulness, screen use, right? How all of these different things that we've talked about for self-care and well-being, and puts it into an 8-week guide that helps to, we hope, improve the well-being of students on campus. So this is a small group guide. I say that just to say, if you know of anyone who would be interested in using it, please feel free to refer them to us. Or if you are interested in running a small group with your candidates or clergy members, this is applicable really for lots of folks. It was targeted toward college students, but we think it would be really great in seminaries and universities, grad school situations as well. So anyway, this is the result of all of this research, and I'm really excited to get it out there. We've been running a few pilot groups this fall and have had really amazing results thus far. If you are interested in the Awakened Life curriculum or anything else that you heard today, please feel free to contact me. This is my information at GBHEM. Like I said, I love this stuff. I'm really passionate about people living their best lives, and if there are ways that I can help to resource you or support you in that, please feel free to reach out. And thank you so much. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Sarah. Another major initiative that Sarah is involved in, she is actually going to be leaving us rather soon. So if you do want to talk to her, you need to do that now. She's leaving to head out to South Africa to work with a new initiative that GBHEM is leading in doing international capacity training for chaplains in a global environment. So she will be working with military college, hospital chaplains in South Africa for the rest of this week. So thank you for your time, and thank you for being with us today. We will take a break now until 11:15.